She moved through Seattle General like a ghost in Scrubs, which was precisely the point. 11 p.m., the fluorescent lights humming their familiar dirge overhead, the night shift stretching ahead with the weight of 8 months of invisibility. Sarah Chen pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor, her footsteps silent on the linoleum, her movements economical, precise. Everything she did was designed to not be noticed. Not the way she walked. Not the way she turned corners. Not the way her hands moved with the practiced speed of someone who had once organized surgical kits under fire. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a sterile bouquet that had become her oxygen. She'd worked at Seattle General in Colorado Springs for 8 months now, ever since the Pentagon's paperwork had officially erased Captain Sarah Chen from every military database and slid her into civilian life with orders to disappear. Not dead, just gone. Just a nurse. Just another tired woman pushing supplies down the night shift corridors where nobody asked questions because questions meant paperwork meant attention. The timing was deliberate. Night shift meant fewer supervisors, fewer physicians watching, fewer chances that someone would look too closely at her hands. Her scarred, capable hands. The left one carried shrapnel residue just beneath the surface. You could see it if you looked closely, little silver streaks under the skin like someone had tried to draw a map of her service record with a scalpel. She kept the sleeves of her scrubs long. She kept her head down. She kept moving. Trauma Bay 3 was empty at this hour. Most rooms were. The emergencies that arrived at 11 p.m. didn't hit Seattle General on the night shift. They hit the trauma centers downtown, the Level 1 facilities where the helicopters landed and the serious cases came through with their shattered bones and their punctured organs and their desperate last chances. Here, on the night shift at Seattle General, Sarah mostly managed stable patients and helped nurses who moved with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to make split-second decisions about who got the blood and who got morphine. She began organizing the suture kits in Trauma Bay 3, arranging them in strict order, needle holders first, then forceps, then scissors arranged by blade length. The motions came from somewhere deeper than thought. This was the order they'd used at Checkpoint 7 in Kandahar, the makeshift aid station she'd held for 11 hours while 40 Taliban fighters probed the perimeter. Her hands remembered. Her body remembered. The sequence was encoded so deep that muscle memory had become muscle truth. Efficient. The voice came from the doorway. Sarah didn't startle. She'd heard the footsteps from 40 feet away, recognized the particular cadence of someone walking with the authority of a title he believed gave him dominion over this floor. Dr. Mercer. 46 years old, Omega watch worth $12,000, expensive cologne that tried to hide the smell of expensive whiskey. He ran cardiology like he ran everything else, with the assumption that competence was genetic and that anyone who questioned him was simply too stupid to understand. Just organizing supplies, Doctor, Sarah said, not looking up from the instruments. Her voice was soft, deferential. Practice. 18 months of practice at being nobody. He stepped into the bay. She heard the fabric of his coat shift as he moved closer, the small sounds that expensive tailoring made. He was studying her. She could feel the weight of his attention like a light being aimed at something in the dark. "You've been here 8 months, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Prior experience in trauma. Sarah's hands continued their work, lifting each instrument with the same careful precision. She'd learned to answer questions while doing something else. It made lies easier and truth sound less suspicious. Some emergency medicine rotation during nursing school. Nothing extensive. This was true in the way that lies often are, factually accurate but fundamentally dishonest. Her emergency medicine rotation had been in a Level 1 trauma center. Her prior experience in trauma involved holding pressure on wounds while mortar rounds hit 50 meters from her position. She'd done emergency medicine at Bagram Airfield while serving with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines as a MARSOC field medic, before the op in Kandahar went wrong and the Pentagon decided that Captain Sarah Chen needed to become someone else entirely. "You have unusual competence," Mercer said. "I've observed it. The way you move. The way you anticipate needs. It's not what we typically see in nursing staff." Sarah placed the last instrument in its place. The organization was flawless, the geometry perfect. "Just trying to do the job well, Doctor." "Of course," he said, and she heard something shift in his voice, a tone that suggested he'd made a note of something, filed something away in the part of his brain where he kept useful ammunition. "Carry on." He left. She didn't move until his footsteps had receded down the corridor, had turned the corner toward the stairs, had faded into the white noise of the hospital's mechanical breathing. Only then did she exhale, a small controlled breath that didn't disturb the air around her. The next 4 hours moved with the routine momentum of night shift. She checked patients, monitored vitals, prepared medications. The work was automatic, which meant her mind could wander, something she usually prevented. At midnight, she found herself standing outside room 312, holding a medication chart for a patient recovering from an appendectomy. The chart was perfect except for one thing. The dosing was wrong. She read it twice to be certain. Vancomycin prescribed at 15 mg per kilogram every 8 hours, but the patient's weight had been recorded as 42 kilograms when the chart note from admission showed 68 kilograms. The error would deliver a dose 60% below therapeutic level. The infection would bloom in the surgical site. The patient would deteriorate. By morning, it might be too late. Sarah went to the medication dispensary and pulled up the electronic record. 68 kilograms. She cross-checked the lab values, the original weight was correct. The dosing error was a simple transcription mistake, the kind that happened 1,000 times a day in hospitals across the country, the kind that usually got caught. The kind that sometimes didn't. She walked back to the nursing station where Jennifer Martinez was charting, her head down over her computer screen, looking tired in the way that only night shift nurses understood. Sarah set the chart on the desk. "I think there's a weight discrepancy in room 312, Sarah said quietly. "The current dose is based on 42 kilos, but the admission chart shows 68. Jennifer's head came up. She was a good nurse, the kind who appreciated when someone caught her mistakes, the kind who knew that getting corrected by a colleague at midnight was better than having to explain it to a physician in the morning. "Oh shit. Thank you. I must have." She pulled up the system, read the error, shook her head. "I was on back-to-back shifts yesterday. My brain's not working." "It happens," Sarah said. "I can help you update it if you want." "Would you?" Jennifer's relief was tangible. "Just fix the weight, and the system should auto-recalculate the dose." Sarah made the correction, 68 kilograms entered, the vancomycin dose recalculated upward, the medication profile corrected. It took 90 seconds. Jennifer thanked her, genuinely, the way people do when someone has just prevented what could have been a bad day. Sarah nodded and returned to her rounds. She didn't think about the correction again. But someone was thinking about it. At 1:15 a.m., Dr. Mercer pulled up the patient record in room 312. He saw the medication dosing had been changed at 12:58 a.m. He pulled the edit log. Sarah Chen had made the change. He read the admission notes, the chart history, the original dosing prescription. The error was obvious, he saw it immediately. What he also saw was that Sarah Chen had caught something that the resident who wrote the order had missed, something that Jennifer Martinez's tired eyes had let slide, something that the automated safety system should have flagged but hadn't. He made another note on his tablet. This time, the note said, "Protocol deviation. Scope of practice violation. Nurses do not make independent clinical judgments about medication corrections." This was technically true. Nurses did not independently change physician orders. Nurses caught errors and reported them. The process was designed to separate the catching from the correcting. Sarah Chen had caught an error and then, with the permission of the treating nurse, corrected it. He opened a new document on his tablet and titled it, "Chen, Personnel Issues." He began writing, documenting her unusual competence as a symptom of something darker, a lack of respect for hierarchy, an inappropriate assumption of clinical authority, a pattern of behavior that suggested she believed herself qualified for decisions that belonged to physicians. He was building something, though he wouldn't know what until he had more pieces. At 2 a.m., Sarah stood in front of her locker in the basement break room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that made the space feel more like a basement than it really was. The bleach smell was stronger here, mixing with stale coffee and the particular coal tile odor of a place where the hospital machinery hummed behind the walls. She opened the narrow metal door and looked at what remained of her life. 3 pairs of scrubs. 1 pair of shoes. A worn stethoscope. And in the back corner, wrapped carefully in cloth, the folded flag from Marcus Halloway's casket. Marcus had been her second lieutenant at Checkpoint 7. He'd bled out in her arms while mortar rounds hammered the compound, and she'd applied tourniquets to legs that were already gone. The flag had come to his family in a box with an apology from the Pentagon, and it had made its way to Sarah somehow, one of those things that happened in the military, the kind of physical transfer of objects that acknowledged a debt that could never be paid. She didn't touch the flag. She never did, except to move it when she transferred between shifts. But she knew it was there. The weight of it was present in her locker the way some weights are present in a life, not physically pressing down, but always, always there. There was a photograph too, buried behind the flag. She didn't look at it. There were 12 people in that photograph, and of those 12, she was the only one who was still alive, and even that was arguable, depending on how you defined alive. She definitely breathed. She paid taxes. She worked a job. But the woman in the photograph had been a different person entirely. She closed the locker, locked it, and walked back upstairs. The rest of the shift passed quietly. At 4 a.m., when the night shift began its slow transition toward morning, Sarah was in room 407, checking before sight of an elderly man named Harrison who'd come in with congestive heart failure. His breathing was better since the diuretics had started working, his oxygen saturation was at 92%, his heart rate steady at 78 beats per minute. He was going to be okay. Most of them were going to be okay on the night shift. The night shift was for the manageable cases, for the people whose bodies had decided to fight another day. "Thank you," Harrison said as she adjusted the 4 bag. "You make it look easy." "It is easy," Sarah replied, and that was true in a way he wouldn't understand. Everything at Seattle General was easy compared to what she'd done before. Every patient here had access to medications, had blood products, had physicians. At Checkpoint 7, she'd done emergency thoracotomies with a combat knife and had somehow kept people alive with willpower and plasma and prayers whispered in the language of someone who'd never believed in God but was willing to try anything once. "Easy or not, you're good at it," Harrison said. She smiled slightly and finished her rounds. At 6 a.m., as the day shift began filtering in through the lobby, Sarah sat in the basement break room and wrapped her stethoscope carefully around her locker door. Above her, she could hear the hospital waking up, the elevator doors opening and closing, the distant code being called overhead, the surge of personnel coming on shift. The world above was beginning. The night was ending. She'd been working night shift for 8 months, and in that time, exactly one person had noticed that she was unusual. She'd caught one medication error, made one small clinical judgment, prevented one small catastrophe. Tomorrow, she would work again, and the night shift would continue, and the world would move forward with the assumption that Sarah Chen was nobody special, just a nurse doing a job. But Dr. Mercer had started documenting. He had started building a case. He had no idea what he was building a case against. He didn't know that his careful documentation would eventually lead somewhere he couldn't predict, somewhere that would cost him everything. He just knew that Sarah Chen was not what she appeared to be, and his entire career had been built on the principle that anything unusual was a threat, and threats needed to be neutralized. He was very, very good at neutralizing things. He just had no idea what he was about to try to destroy. The conference room at Seattle General held 70 staff members seated in tiered rows like a theater audience awaiting a performance. The lights dimmed. A projector hummed to life, casting an incident report across the white screen in letters large enough to read from the back. Sarah's name. Her shift date. The medication error she'd caught on Dr. Mercer's cardiac patient, a dosing calculation that would have pushed digoxin into the lethal range. She sat motionless in the 3rd row, hands folded in her lap, her posture the picture of a subordinate attending grand rounds. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium like a conductor preparing his orchestra. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his credentials like armor, Columbia Medical School, 15 years as department head, a reputation for precision that was really a reputation for control. He adjusted the laser pointer in his hand, and the red dot circled Sarah's name on the screen. "Miss Chen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of academic authority, "has provided us with an instructive moment about protocol deviation." The dot moved to her title. Registered nurse. Night shift. You see here, no MD, no DO, yet she felt qualified to override my clinical judgment on a patient I had personally assessed. He paused, letting that hang in the recycled air. The hierarchy of medical care exists for a reason. It keeps patients safe. It prevents catastrophic errors born from overconfidence. An intern in the front row smiled nervously. A resident turned to his colleague, eyebrows raised in that subtle performance of solidarity with authority. Sarah's gaze was flat. Arctic. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than a man with a laser pointer. "You're a nurse, Miss Chen, not a physician." Mercer's voice dropped, taking on the tone of a disappointed mentor. "Perhaps you've forgotten the hierarchy that keeps patients safe." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim their hum. Sarah stood. Not rushed. Not defensive. She rose with the precision of someone trained to move through hostile territory, and she met Dr. Mercer's eyes with the kind of stare that could cut through reinforced steel. "I haven't forgotten anything, Doctor." 14 words. Delivered in a voice that had somehow dropped an octave. "Have you double-checked your billing codes for last month's thoracotomies?" The room went so quiet you could hear the rain beginning outside, pattering against the windows like distant gunfire. Residents stared at their laps. Attending physicians suddenly found tremendous interest in their clipboards. A nurse in the back row's mouth fell open. Mercer's face darkened, not the red flush of embarrassment, but something colder. The purple of rage being swallowed. His jaw worked, but no sound came. The laser pointer trembled slightly in his hand before he lowered it. Sarah turned and walked toward the exit. Her scrubs whispered against her legs with each step. Her badge caught the light. She didn't look back. The performance was over. But the real work had just begun. 2 days later, at the vending machines outside the ER during Sarah's break, Mercer found her. He'd been waiting, she realized. Timing it. Another audience, 3 nurses at the coffee station, a resident reviewing labs on his phone, a security guard stationed nearby. This wasn't about her. This was about witnesses. The nurse, he said loudly enough for passing staff to hear, getting her dinner from a machine. How appropriate, processed, generic, easily replaced. An intern snickered on cue, a sound like broken glass. Sarah selected her crackers without looking at him. Her jaw was set like stone, her movements economical and controlled. She inserted a dollar bill. The machine hummed. The crackers dropped with a dull thud. "You should consider whether this job is really suited to your skill level," Mercer continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "It would be unfortunate if another incident resulted in actual harm." She retrieved the crackers and turned to face him. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to see nothing but a mirror of his own insignificance reflected back. Then she walked past him, so close he caught the scent of hospital-grade antiseptic and something else. Something metallic. Like gun oil. The following week, during a procedure on a peripheral access line, Mercer gave her an order delivered at deliberate speed, the catheter size intentionally ambiguous. She handed him what she thought he'd asked for, but she knew it was wrong even as she did it. He'd set the trap. Now he was springing it. Even the simplest tasks, he sighed theatrically, looking at the catheter in his hand. Security might need to escort you out before you hurt someone. She stood across from him, one hand steadying the patient's arm. Her jaw moved once. Then she said nothing. she simply handed him the correct size catheter and continued assisting with the precision of a machine, every movement exact, every prediction ahead of his needs, making him look like an amateur fumbling through a procedure he no longer fully understood. The attending physicians noticed. They always noticed. That night, in the basement laundry room where industrial washers drummed their rhythm and steam rose like ghosts from the dryers, Sarah folded her scrubs with methodical care. The smell of bleach and hot cotton filled the air. She'd been filing complaints. She'd pulled the incident reports from the system. 6 of them in 10 days. Scope of practice violations. Insubordination. Failure to follow direct orders. Each one carefully documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced with hospital policy. Death by 1,000 forms. That was his strategy. Her locker hung open on the wall, and inside it, beneath her spare shoes and a rolled-up sweater, sat the folded flag. Military ceremonial fold. 13 triangles. The fabric so old it had faded from blue to something closer to grey, and the stars had lost their shine years ago. She didn't touch it. But she looked at it for a long moment, the way someone might look at a photograph of a person they once were. The basement was empty except for her. The machines drummed. The steam rose. And somewhere in her chest, something hard and cold began to sharpen itself. At 0230 hours, the trauma alert sounded. Not a page. Not a quiet announcement. The full alert, all hands. Rollover accident on I-25, multiple casualties inbound, ETA 3 minutes. Sarah was restocking crash carts when the first ambulance doors burst open like a gunshot. They brought the sergeant major in on a backboard, a Marine in his 50s with the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing at attention, even when injured, even when deteriorating. His shoulders were broad, his uniform still crisp despite the wreckage. The paramedics rattled off vitals, BP dropping, respiratory rate climbing, paradoxical chest movement visible even through his shirt. Sarah caught him as the gurney rolled past. Took his vitals. Called them out. Noted the tracheal deviation developing, the neck veins distending like rope under tension. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this before, in conditions far worse than a hospital corridor, with tools far more primitive than monitors and oxygen tanks. Tension pneumothorax, she said quietly to the resident beside her. We need needle decompression. Now. The resident hesitated, looking toward the attending. Dr. Mercer was already there, moving through the trauma bay with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. Portable X-ray, Mercer ordered. Full workup. We follow protocol. His oxygen saturation is dropping, Sarah said. If we wait for X-ray. You think? Mercer's voice was ice. I didn't realize Seattle General promoted nurses to radiology. He turned to the resident as if she hadn't spoken. As if she were already invisible. The sergeant major's eyes found hers across the chaos of the trauma bay. He was struggling to breathe now, his chest heaving, his hand reaching out. And in that moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not of her face. Of something deeper. Something he'd seen before in a place called Kandahar, in a checkpoint called 7, in the hands of a person he thought was dead. Sarah's hand moved toward her pocket where she kept a pen. 14-gauge angiocath. Field expedient decompression. Needle into the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. Sinus rhythm restored. She stopped herself. Her fingers froze an inch from the fabric. She had no authority here. She was a nurse. Just a nurse. Civilian. Erased. The monitor began to alarm, a shriek that cut through the trauma bay like a blade. The monitor's shriek cut through the trauma bay like a blade. Code blue, the intercom screamed. Trauma alert inbound, ETA for minutes. Multiple vehicle collision, I-25 northbound near exit 142. Sarah's hand stilled on the crash cart she'd been restocking. 2:11 a.m. The fluorescent hum overhead seemed to deepen, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. She moved to the supply station and began pulling drawers with methodical precision. Thoracotomy kits. Chest tubes in ascending sizes. Arterial lines. The motions came naturally, the kind of automatic competence that made residents pause when they watched her work. Nobody questioned the why of it anymore. They'd stopped asking after the third time she'd anticipated what Dr. Mercer would call for before he actually did. Now they just watched and stayed quiet. The ambulance bays opened with the sound of hydraulic pressure hissing. Sirens approached from the north, wailing across the city like artillery support. Sarah moved to Trauma Bay 3, the one with the best light and the most space, and began laying out instruments on the sterile field. Tape. Gloves. Saline. The smell of antiseptic and the underlying metal-sharp tang of anticipation filled the small room. Her tactical breathing came automatically, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Old habits. The first gurney wheeled in at 2:51 a.m. Lacerations, conscious, alert. That one went to Bay 1. The second came through at 2:53. Femur fracture, stable vitals. Bay 2. Then the doors burst open again and Sarah heard the paramedic's voice before she saw the patient. Unresponsive. Shallow respirations. Tension pneumo, we think. BP's crashed twice. Last reading was 68/42. The gurney rolled past her bay. Sarah stepped into the doorway and saw the Marine. Not conscious, not anymore. His skin had taken on that waxy, oxygen-starved pallor she'd seen exactly twice before, once in Kandahar, once in her nightmares. His breathing was barely visible under the oxygen mask. The left side of his chest wasn't rising with the right. Collapsed lung. The pressure building inside his thoracic cavity, crushing his heart, squeezing the blood vessels until his circulation became theoretical rather than actual. Every heartbeat pushing air into a space where air didn't belong. He was dying in front of her, one shallow breath at a time. Bay 3, Dr. Mercer's voice cut across the chaos. He was at the nurse's station, watching. Not moving. Just observing, the way a man might watch a malfunctioning machine to document exactly when it would fail. Bay 3 is prepped for thoracotomy, Sarah heard herself say. Her voice came out flat, professional. A statement of fact. Mercer's eyes lifted from his clipboard and found hers across the trauma bay. The message in the gaze was unmistakable: you stay back. You watch. You let this happen. The Marine's oxygen saturation was falling. 92, 87. 82, the numbers climbed down the monitor in a death march that would end somewhere around 40, at which point consciousness would vanish, then brain death would follow in the silence that nobody likes to acknowledge. Sarah's hands, the hands that had held lives together in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley while mortars fell like rain, remained absolutely still at her sides. Dr. Mercer was moving now. Slowly. Calling for the intubation tray, which would take 90 seconds to set up. Calling for chest tubes, which required 2 people and sterile technique and time, so much time the Marine didn't have. The resident at the bedside was panicking, trying to establish for access in an arm that was already losing perfusion. The blood pressure was impossible to get now. The veins were collapsing like buildings after a siege. Sarah moved. Not toward Dr. Mercer. Not toward the monitor. She moved to the crash cart in Bay 3, where the thoracotomy kit was waiting like a loaded weapon, and she picked it up without hesitation. Her fingers already knew which instrument she would need. Which sutures? Which drains? The combat knife came in her hand like muscle memory made manifest. Stop, Mercer said from the nurse's station. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a command, it was the voice of a man watching a boundary being crossed. That patient requires proper procedure. Proper procedure. As if the Marine had time for protocol. As if Sarah hadn't performed this exact operation 73 times in a dusty compound that no longer existed on any map the Pentagon officially acknowledged. She moved to Bay 3 and stepped to the bedside. The resident there, an anxious third year named Patterson, stepped back. His mouth had already fallen open. He'd been in the hospital long enough to have heard the rumors about Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse who moved like someone who'd been trained to operate under fire. Tonight he was about to watch those rumors become flesh and blood. Sarah's gloved hands moved across the Marine's chest. Left nipple. Second intercostal space. The anatomical landmarks came back to her body the way language came to someone's mouth in dreams, foreign and somehow absolutely native at once. She prepped the insertion site with alcohol-soaked gauze. The smell of it filled the small bay, sharp and chemical. 30 seconds. That's all it took. The thoracotomy kit opened like a field surgical station. Sarah's fingers found the instruments without looking, the scalpel, the Kelly clamp, the retractor. The muscle memory wasn't a pleasant thing. It was the memory of survival, of hands learning to work while mortars were falling, while blood was pooling on a concrete floor, while a young Marine from 3rd Battalion was trying to keep his friend from dying. She made the incision. The Marine's body was already dropping in pressure so catastrophically that there was almost no bleeding. The blade parted skin and subcutaneous tissue with a kind of precise surgical movement that the residents would later describe as like watching someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. They would not ask questions because they already knew the shape of the answer. The parietal pleura came down. Sarah's fingers could feel the collapsed lung beneath the membrane, see the air that had nowhere to go, understand the physics of it in a way that was purely tactile. She entered the pleural space with practiced care, keeping the blade perpendicular, knowing exactly how deep to cut. The hiss came as it always did, a sound like the last breath of a dying man, which, technically, is what it was. Air that had been stealing a life came rushing out through the incision, and suddenly the Marine's lung could expand again. His oxygen saturation climbed. 85, 88. 91, the monitor's rhythm began to normalize. A normal sinus rhythm, the one that meant the heart could work again because the pressure was gone. The Marine's hand shot up and grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength for someone whose blood pressure had been measured at 68/42 90 seconds earlier. His eyes rolled open. Unfocused. But searching. Finding her face. "Kandahar," he whispered. His voice was barely air passing through a damaged throat. "You were the angel of Checkpoint 7. Sarah's hand stilled. Just for a moment. Just for the heartbeat where the entire architecture of her cover, the 4 years of invisibility, the careful construction of a woman who was nothing more than a talented nurse, all of it became fragile as glass. She finished draining the remaining air from his pleural cavity. She placed the tube where it needed to be. She worked with the same surgical precision that had saved his life once before, in a compound that didn't exist, under a name that had been officially erased. The sergeant major's grip on her wrist loosened as his consciousness faded back toward shock and morphine and the medical safety of not remembering anything else. Sarah stripped off her gloves. The sound they made as she peeled them away was sharp, accusatory. Dr. Mercer was already at the nurse's station, his phone in his hand, recording. Documenting. Building his file. "You just violated every scope of practice regulation in the State Nursing Board manual," Mercer said. His voice came out even, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been shouting. "That was a procedure outside your credentials. I'm filing a complaint with the hospital board within the hour. You're done here, Miss Chen. This shift. This career. This is over." He was already turning away, already pulling up the transfer orders on his computer, already routing the sergeant major to Denver Memorial, for hours north and out of Sarah's reach. Sarah stood in the trauma bay with the Marine's blood drying on her scrubs and said nothing because she couldn't explain how her hands knew combat medicine without explaining that she'd once been someone else entirely. Someone who'd held a field hospital together while people were dying. Someone with a rank and a unit and a service record that the Pentagon had decided should be erased from every official database. She couldn't say any of that. She could only stand there while Dr. Mercer constructed her destruction with the cold efficiency of a man who'd learned bureaucracy was sharper than any scalpel. Within 90 minutes, she had a termination file. Within 2 hours, it had been processed. By the time her shift ended at 7 a.m., she was officially on medical leave pending an investigation into gross negligence and scope violations. The Marine's hand had released hers. But she could still feel the pressure of it as she walked to the locker room. She could still feel the word hanging in the air, spoken by someone who'd seen her across 1,000 miles and 4 years, someone who remembered her by a call sign she wasn't supposed to have anymore. Angel. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had all of it on video now. The procedure. The Marine's recognition. The call sign. The proof that she was something other than what she claimed to be. And in exactly 2 days, a Pentagon line that was supposed to be dormant was going to ring at Seattle General's main desk, and nobody would know why. For 2 days, Dr. Mercer constructed her destruction with the patience of a career bureaucrat. Not shouting. Not threatening. Just filing. Incident reports about insubordination. Witness statements from residents too frightened to tell the truth, so they wrote what he needed them to write. Joint Commission violation citations. Protocol deviation documentation. The dossier grew so thick it required binder clips, 3 of them, and he kept it in his office drawer like a surgeon keeps his instruments sharp. Every page another nail. Every signature another witness. He was building a case so airtight that no hospital administrator could ignore it, no HR director could challenge it, no union representative could defend against it. The paperwork was his weapon, and it was far more effective than a raised voice could ever be. By day 1, he'd already moved on the sergeant major. A phone call to Denver Presbyterian. A transfer request citing optimal post-operative care environment. The patient was stable, he explained. The Marine would benefit from the higher-level facility. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in professional courtesy. The sergeant major would be gone by tomorrow evening, the witness removed, the complication solved. Mercer had done this before, separated patients from staff who might talk, isolated threats before they could become public problems. He knew the architecture of institutional power. You didn't announce dismissals. You prepared the ground. You moved the pieces. Then you delivered the firing with such perfect documentation that fighting back became impossible. Sarah's termination notice arrived on her phone at 6:56 p.m. on day 2. Not a conversation. Not a meeting. A text message from the hospital's HR system, followed by a formal email marked effective immediately. She was to surrender her badge and return all hospital property. Security would escort her from the premises. She read the words 3 times, standing in the medication bay, the fluorescent ceiling lights casting everything in the hospital white that never quite looked natural. Around her, nurses moved through evening routines, nobody watching her, nobody knowing that her employment had just ended in a message delivered to her pocket like a text from a friend. She descended to the basement laundry room an hour later. The air hung thick with steam and the chemical sharpness of bleach, a smell that would always mean something specific to her now. Endings. The industrial dryers thundered in their cycles, their heat turning the space into something between a sauna and a furnace. She folded her scrubs for the last time, the fabric still warm from the industrial machines, and the indignity of it settled over her like ash. Returning hospital laundry like checking out of a cheap motel. 8 months of nights. Of catching errors before they became tragedies. Of hands moving steady while people died around her. And they would find another night shift nurse tomorrow. The hospital would continue. The machines would keep running. Dr. Mercer would keep filing his reports and building his cases, and nobody would ever know the difference between a nurse who left and a nurse who was destroyed. Her locker was in the corner, unremarkable. She opened it and saw what she'd carried with her since the ambush. The folded flag. A triangle of fabric in the colors of the United States, folded with the precision of ritual, holding the weight of her team leader who died in the dust outside Checkpoint 7. The fabric was heavier than it should have been. It always was. She held it for a long moment, feeling the ceremony of it, the respect of it, the loneliness of it. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with restraint. The kind of trembling that comes from holding something true while the world demands you lie. She heard boots on the basement stairs. Security. Their radios crackling with channel chatter. Her time to leave had arrived. But that wasn't the worst part. The ER doors burst open 2 floors above. The trauma alert sounded, gunshot wound, critical status, incoming. The overhead paging system crackled to life, trauma activation. Level 1. Estimated 2 minutes. Sarah heard it through the basement ceiling vents, the sound traveling down through decades of hospital infrastructure. She should leave. She was already fired. Her badge wouldn't work anymore. In approximately 90 seconds, security would reach her locker and find her standing there holding a flag, and they would escort her out to the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall in that Colorado way, sharp and cold and indifferent. She moved toward the stairs. When she reached the ER, the trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos. Paramedics shouting vitals. Nurses cutting away clothing. The patient was seizing, abdominal gunshot wound, entry point left of midline, exit wound open and bleeding. Dr. Mercer stood at the head of the gurney, already commanding, already orchestrating the machines and the bodies and the precision that was supposed to save lives. He didn't see Sarah enter the bay. Nobody saw her. She was invisible now. Fired. Not permitted to be here. The patient's eyes opened in the seconds between seizures. His gaze found hers across the controlled chaos of the trauma room. And the name that came from his mouth stopped everyone mid-motion. Valkyrie. Then again, louder, in a voice that had learned English on a battlefield, Valkyrie. The word hung in the trauma bay like a bullet that hadn't landed yet. Nurses glanced at each other. A resident's hands froze above a medication cart. Dr. Mercer turned, his face transitioning from focus to confused to something darker. The patient was a man in his early 40s, scarred across his left shoulder and ribs, his eyes burning with recognition and relief and something that looked like salvation. A former Taliban fighter. Now a refugee with asylum status, which meant paperwork and legal documentation and a path to safety that the American government had provided. Which meant nobody expected him to recognize a name that hadn't been spoken in public in 7 years. "You are terminated," Dr. Mercer said, not even looking at Sarah, his voice sharpening like a scalpel finding an edge. "Security is on the way. Step away from the patient." But the patient kept screaming the name. In Pashto first, the vowels harsh and urgent. Then in English, mangling the pronunciation but getting the meaning across, "Captain. Captain Valkyrie. You saved us. You held them. 11 hours you held the line." From the hallway, from a wheelchair positioned where he had a perfect view of the ER, the sergeant major rose to his feet despite orders, despite his injuries, despite everything a reasonable person would do. His phone was in his hand. His voice, when it came, was parade ground loud, the kind of voice trained to carry across a battlefield. "Captain Sarah Chen," he said. The ER went silent. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same moment. A dropped instrument clattering on the tile floor became the loudest sound in the room. Mercer opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in his expression changed, a flicker of recognition, the dawning understanding that he'd made a calculation error. Navy Cross recipient, the sergeant major continued, his phone displaying the citation he'd spent 2 days researching obsessively, every reference compiled from public databases and service records. Nurses turned toward Sarah. A resident backed against the wall. The charge nurse's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the ground. Silver star with Vela device. The doors to the ER slid open. A 2-star general stepped through, dress uniform so precisely arranged it looked like tactical equipment. His presence altered the air pressure in the room. He'd been at Peterson Space Force Base for a routine visit when the sergeant major's call came through, one Marine to another, requesting a favor, providing coordinates. The general had driven 7 minutes through Colorado Springs traffic to stand in a hospital hallway and bear witness to what was about to unfold. He took one look at Sarah's face. His hand rose. The salute was crisp enough to cut glass. "Captain Chen." "It's an honor." The ER erupted in whispers. Mercer backed away, his face draining of color, the purple rage transitioning to something close to white shock. An intern whispered, "She's a Marine officer." A nurse breathed, "She saved that entire outpost alone." "Marsoc," the general said, his voice carrying authority that required no volume. "Force reconnaissance attachment." When her team was KIA in Kandahar, she held the aid station and 17 wounded for 11 hours until extraction. The charge nurse had both hands over her mouth. 3 Purple Hearts, the sergeant major added, still standing, defiant against his injuries. 2 Silver Stars. And the Navy Cross for actions in direct contradiction of everything this hospital claims to value. The general's expression hardened. Her call sign was Valkyrie because she brought the dead back to life. 17 times. In 11 hours. Under sustained fire. The ER doors opened again. A Pentagon representative in a civilian suit entered, federal identification already displayed, and said the words that made Mercer's legs buckle beneath him. The investigation Dr. Mercer filed against Captain Chen triggered an automatic Department of Defense audit of all clinical staff with security clearances. "We found some interesting billing irregularities. $1.2 million in fraudulent surgical supply orders over 18 months. Every transaction routed through accounts registered in the Cayman Islands." Sarah didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't give Mercer the satisfaction of watching her react. She simply stood there in the trauma bay, the flag still in her locker downstairs, her invisible armor more powerful than any rank could ever be. Security entered from the hallway. But they weren't walking toward Sarah anymore. Security entered from the hallway. But they weren't walking toward Sarah anymore. Their pace had shifted, their attention snapping upward as the ER doors burst open 3 floors above, the sound traveling down through the hospital's spine like electricity through copper wire. A new trauma. The codes crackled over the intercom, gunshot wound, male, 34, incoming to Bay 2. Priority alert. The security officers exchanged glances, then moved past Sarah without a word, drawn toward the emergency like every other person in the building. Sarah's hand was still on her locker door. The folded flag lay across her palm, heavier than its weight had any right to be. She could have walked then. Could have taken the service stairs, crossed the parking lot, disappeared into the Colorado Springs dawn with her severance check and her secrets intact. The hospital had already written her off. The paperwork was done. Dr. Mercer had seen to that. But the patient screaming upstairs in Trauma Bay 2 had a voice she recognized. The ER was chaos the way trauma bays always are, a controlled, practiced chaos with 7 people moving like a school of fish that knew each other's rhythms without speaking. Trauma surgeon, 2 residents, 3 nurses, 1 respiratory tech. The gunshot victim was being transferred from the gurney to the trauma bed as the trauma surgeon called out vitals, BP 98/62, dropping. O2 sat 89 on 12 liters. 2 large bore fours running, 1 unit packed red cells wide open. Sarah moved through the edge of the bay without thinking. Her feet knew this space. Her hands knew what came next. No one stopped her because she moved like she belonged there, and the thing about belonging is that most people never question it if you carry yourself with enough certainty. The patient's eyes were dark, scarred across the left side of his face with the kind of burn pattern that came from IED fragmentation. Not current trauma. Old injury. A map of survival written in scar tissue. His head turned toward the monitor, his chest heaving with the shallow breathing of a man in shock, and then his gaze caught on the nurses moving around him. Caught. Held. His pupils dilated, whether from shock or recognition, Sarah couldn't tell yet. Then he screamed. "Valkyrie! Valkyrie!" His voice cracked like breaking glass, urgent and ancient at once. Valkyrie, oh God, Valkyrie, his right hand clawed at the fall line, at the monitors, at the air between himself and the nurses. Captain Chen, you're alive, you're. The trauma surgeon's head snapped up. Get him sedated. He's becoming combative. Sarah didn't move. Couldn't move. The name, her call sign, her buried name, the identity that existed only in classified files, and the nightmares of people who'd been in Kandahar when Checkpoint 7 held for 11 hours against a Taliban assault that should have overrun the position in 40 minutes, hung in the air between them like a detonation that hadn't finished its work. The patient's eyes locked onto hers. Brown eyes scarred white at the edges from blast trauma. Eyes that had watched her work in a field hospital built from sandbags and prayer, her hands moving through procedures that had no names in any hospital in America because they existed only in the dark places where official medicine ended and survival medicine began. "It's him," Sarah heard herself say. The words came out in a voice she didn't recognize anymore, deeper, older, stripped of every careful deferential inflection she perfected over 8 months. He was at the outpost. Checkpoint 7. The sergeant major appeared in the trauma bay doorway on a nurse's arm. His chest tube was still in place, his mobility limited, his eyes bright with recognition that turned to fury as he took in the scene, Sarah standing at the edge of the trauma bed, the Taliban fighter screaming her name, the residents frozen in confusion at the call sign echoing through the ER. The sergeant major moved forward, not fast, his injuries prevented that, but with the kind of deliberate authority that made people instinctively step aside. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his robe pocket, and the sound of it opening was loud in the sudden silence, the crisp snap of official documentation, military letterhead, DoD seal embossed at the top. Captain Sarah Chen, the sergeant major read, his voice cutting through the trauma bay like a blade. Navy Cross. Silver Star. For actions under fire where she held a compromised field hospital for 11 hours against coordinated Taliban assault, providing emergency surgical intervention to 17 personnel under sustained combat conditions, including, he paused, his eyes moving to the screaming patient, this man. Specialist Ahmed Rashid. She saved his life with a field thoracotomy using a combat knife because there was no other instrument available. The outpost was overrun twice. She was overrun twice. She kept working. Dr. Mercer appeared in the trauma bay doorway like a purple-faced storm. Absolutely not. His voice was hoarse with fury. This is a HIPAA violation. This is patient privacy breach. Security. He shoved forward, his body positioning itself between the sergeant major and the patient with the desperation of a man who could feel something slipping away. That man's medical history is confidential. You cannot discuss, you cannot. She violated protocol, Mercer continued, his words accelerating into a desperate blur. She performed procedures outside her nursing scope. She endangered this patient. I was protecting, I documented everything. Every violation. Every unauthorized. The 2-star general stepped into the trauma bay from the hallway. His uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. His boots polished to a mirror finish. His presence made the air pressure change, as if the room had become too small for him. He took one look at Sarah's face, at her posture, at the way her hands had moved instinctively toward the trauma patient, at the scar tissue on her forearms visible beneath the scrub sleeves, and he rendered a salute. Not casual. Not social. The kind of salute you give to someone who has held ground when the ground was collapsing, crisp, precise, a fist that could cut glass brought to temple with the snap of absolute respect. Captain Chen, the general said. His voice was calm the way the center of a hurricane is calm. At ease. The Pentagon representative arrived 43 minutes later, riding the elevator with a federal agent. The rep was younger than Sarah expected, maybe 40, carrying a folder with the Department of Defense seal embossed on the leather cover. They found Dr. Mercer in the administrative hallway, hovering at the edge of being escorted out, his face a study in panic and rage. Dr. Mercer, the Pentagon rep said. Not a question. A statement. An ending delivered in a voice that had probably ended dozens of careers. Your complaint about Captain Chen's credentials required us to review all personnel files at Seattle General. Your surgical billing codes flagged our system. There's been a mistake. Mercer's hands were shaking now, his voice climbing toward hysteria. I was protecting patients. I documented her violations. I have every report. Phantom surgical supply orders, the rep continued with bureaucratic dispassion. Equipment purchased but never logged. Thoracotomy procedures billed to Medicare with no corresponding patient recovery records. Surgical materials marked as consumed but appearing again 2 weeks later in billing documentation. The rep opened the folder. Inside was a printed analysis, spreadsheets, highlighted rows of Mercer's own billing codes. $1.2 million. Over 5 years. Distributed across your private consulting account, wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, a beach house in Belize purchased under a shell corporation. Dr. Mercer's face went from purple to gray in stages, the color draining like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth worked soundlessly. Behind the Pentagon rep, 2 federal agents stepped forward. One was reaching for handcuffs. I have rights, Mercer said, his voice cracking. I have a lawyer. This is your Miranda rights, the agent said, and began reading them in the same corridor where Mercer had mocked Sarah's credentials, where he'd called her generic and replaceable, where he'd stood in front of 70 colleagues and informed her that she'd forgotten the hierarchy that kept patients safe. They walked him past the vending machines where he'd once cornered her about protocol violations. Past the conference room where he'd humiliated her with surgical precision and public contempt. Past the nurse's station where every eye tracked him like a condemned man moving through a cathedral. His shoes squeaked on the tile floor. The sound of cuffs ratcheting closed had the quality of finality. Sarah watched through the trauma bay window as they loaded him into the federal vehicle. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Not the kind of catharsis that existed only in movies. Mercer was already irrelevant. He'd accomplished nothing except serving as the instrument that destroyed his own career, the architect of his own exposure. The moment he'd filed those incident reports against her, the moment he'd touched her classified personnel file, he'd triggered an automatic DoD audit that had been waiting to happen since the day the Pentagon had buried her service record and ordered her into civilian life. The Taliban fighter was sedated now, stabilized, his left chest cavity decompressed and draining. The sergeant major sat in a wheelchair at the edge of the ER, his wound management nurse checking his vitals with the kind of gentle competence that came from understanding that this man had already survived impossible things. He saw Sarah approach and nodded toward a corner of the bay, away from the nurse's station. Sarah moved with him, the silence between them carrying the weight of 11 hours in Kandahar, of decisions made without protocols, of survival that required becoming someone the Pentagon had to erase. Checkpoint 7, the sergeant major said quietly. His chest rose and fell with the work of healing ribs and lungs. The rumor said you held it with 17 personnel against 3 coordinated assaults. Said you performed field surgery with whatever was available. With a combat knife when the instruments ran out, Sarah said. Her voice was level, factual. With my hands when there was nothing else. With a prayer that probably didn't reach God but didn't hurt either. The sergeant major nodded slowly. The youngest casualty was 8 years old. Afghan kid, brought in by his father after the fighting moved into the compound. You spent 40 minutes on a tension pneumothorax using a 14-gauge needle and a plastic tube from an 4 kit. He paused. That kid's father brought me here. He's my son now. We've been trying to find you for 7 years. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not breaking, not exactly. More like something that had been locked finally turning over with the right key. She'd spent 8 months moving through Seattle General invisible, competent, deferential, a night shift nurse who caught medication errors and was punished for it. She'd carried the folded flag of her teammate in her locker like a penance for surviving when others didn't. And all of it had been preparation for this, for a moment where her name could be spoken aloud in a hospital without bringing down federal investigations, where her skills could be used without deception, where being Captain Sarah Chen meant something other than erasure. What's his name? Sarah asked. Rashid, the sergeant major said. We call him Ray. He's a corporal now. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Sarah looked through the trauma bay window at the sedated Taliban fighter, no longer a Taliban fighter, just a man who'd survived impossible things and made a choice to reach for something better. The kind of choice the Pentagon had denied her until Mercer's greed had torn the whole thing open. A young resident passed Sarah in the hallway, nodded with genuine respect, and kept walking. No hesitation. No question about her presence or authority. Just respect earned. If you've ever been invisible, if you've ever been underestimated by someone with power who didn't see you, then you know what comes next. You know what it feels like when someone finally sees. Sarah touched the small Marine Corps emblem on her scrubs, newly approved, finally allowed. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. And she'd been helping all along. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and had to prove your worth in silence, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, have you ever been misjudged by someone in authority? Because the quiet ones often carry stories that would reshape how the world sees them.